Chris Carter had always prided himself on being a self-made man. As a rising star in San Francisco's bustling tech scene, he was known for his sharp intellect, relentless ambition, and complete aversion to anything resembling long-term commitment. Relationships? Too complicated. Responsibilities beyond his work? Unthinkable. Chris thrived on independence and control, carefully crafting a life that revolved solely around his career and success. But fate had other plans. One chilly Monday morning, Chris was in his minimalist office overlooking the Bay Bridge when his phone buzzed. It was Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer. Chris almost ignored it. He hadn't thought about his family's affairs in months. But something in Henderson's voicemail, urgent, and terms of inheritance, caught his attention. Minutes later, Chris sat in the lawyer's sleek downtown office, his brows furrowed as Henderson laid out the shocking stipulation. His grandmother, Margaret Carter, a trailblazing innovator in the tech industry, had left behind a legacy that included the crown jewel of her empire, Carter Innovations, a company valued in the billions. But there was a catch. To secure the inheritance, Henderson explained with the calm precision of someone delivering bad news, you must marry within 10 days. Chris blinked. Marry? 10 days? Are you serious? Henderson nodded, sliding a copy of the will across the table. Your grandmother was quite specific. She believed that stability in one's personal life was essential for effective leadership. This was her way of ensuring you're ready for such a responsibility. The words felt surreal. Chris leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Marriage? Stability? These were foreign concepts to a man whose idea of a commitment was upgrading his smartphone before the warranty expired. Let me get this straight, Chris said, his tone tinged with disbelief. You're saying I have 10 days to find someone, marry them, and convince the world it's real, or I lose everything. That's correct, Henderson replied, his voice unwavering. For the first time in years, Chris felt the ground shift beneath him. The life he'd built on independence was suddenly at stake. But the question was, could he meet this impossible challenge? Chris Carter was not one to panic. He thrived in high-pressure situations, his razor-sharp mind always 2 steps ahead of the competition. But as he left Mr. Henderson's office, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. 10 days. 10 days to find a wife and convince the world that their union was real. Back in his apartment, a sleek, high-rise sanctuary filled with modern furniture and zero traces of a personal life, Chris started brainstorming. A traditional approach was out of the question. Dating apps? Too slow. Matchmaking services? Too public. He briefly considered reaching out to his social circle but dismissed the idea just as quickly. Mixing his personal life with his professional one felt like a recipe for disaster. Desperate times call for unconventional measures, Chris muttered to himself. The next morning, over his 3rd cup of espresso, Chris voiced his dilemma to his trusted assistant Elsa. She had been his right hand for years, quick-thinking, resourceful, and unafraid to tell him when he was being ridiculous. You need a wife in 10 days? Elsa asked, her eyebrows arching in disbelief. That's ambitious, even for you. I need a wife, Chris corrected. Not a relationship, not a partner, just someone who understands the arrangement is purely business. Elsa smirked, leaning against his desk. So, you're saying you want a marriage without the messy emotional stuff? Exactly, Chris replied. No drama, no strings, just a mutually beneficial agreement. Elsa tilted her head thoughtfully. Well, you could leverage your network. Someone might be willing to help. For the right incentive. Chris shook his head. I don't want to turn my friends or colleagues into bargaining chips. It has to be someone outside my world, someone who sees this for what it is. That's when Elsa's face lit up. I've got it. Why don't you hire someone? Not through a matchmaking service, but someone who genuinely needs the money. That way, it's purely transactional. The idea took root in Chris's mind. It wasn't conventional, but then again, neither was his situation. A hired partner, someone with no emotional entanglements, might be the perfect solution. That evening, Chris wandered into a small art cafe on a quiet downtown street. It was one of those hidden gems he visited to clear his head, a place where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the soft hum of conversation. He didn't expect to find the answer to his problem there. But then he saw Isabella Torres. She moved behind the counter with effortless grace, her long, dark hair tied back as she juggled coffee orders and cheerful banter with customers. There was something magnetic about her, a confidence in her stride, a spark in her honey-brown eyes. Chris watched as Isabella handled a disgruntled customer with poise, her voice steady yet kind. She wasn't just a waitress, she was a force of nature, commanding respect without demanding it. When she approached his table to take his order, Chris felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Hesitation. But he pushed it aside. This wasn't about emotions. It was about solving a problem. Chris hesitated for a brief moment before clearing his throat. "Excuse me," he began, his tone measured but slightly awkward. "I have an unusual proposal for you." Isabella blinked, her pen hovering over her notepad. "A proposal? For coffee, I assume?" Chris smiled faintly. "Not exactly. How would you feel about making a deal? Marry me for 10 days. Help me meet a legal requirement, and I'll take care of any financial burdens you're facing." The cafe seemed to go silent, or maybe it was just Isabella's world grinding to a halt. She stared at Chris, her expression caught between disbelief and amusement. "You're joking, right?" "I'm completely serious," Chris replied, his eyes steady. "It's a business arrangement, no strings attached." Isabella tilted her head, studying him. "Why me? Out of all the people in this city, why pick a waitress from a cafe?" Chris leaned forward, his voice soft but deliberate. "Because you're not just a waitress. You're sharp, quick-witted, and real. I don't need a socialite or a trophy wife. I need someone who can handle the pressure of this arrangement and walk away without complications." The mention of money made Isabella pause. Her family's small graphic design studio was struggling, and debt was piling up faster than she could manage. Chris's offer could be the lifeline she desperately needed. But agreeing to marry a stranger, even temporarily? It sounded insane. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "What exactly are you offering?" Chris's voice didn't waver. "Complete financial security for the next year. I'll pay off your debts, cover your rent, and ensure your business gets back on its feet. In return, you'll marry me for 10 days, attend a few key events, and help convince my family lawyer this is real. After that, we part ways." Isabella studied him, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and temptation. The risks were clear, but so were the rewards. Slowly, she extended her hand. "All right, Chris," she said, her voice steady. "You've got yourself a deal." The moment the words left Isabella's mouth, she wondered if she'd gone insane. Agreeing to marry a stranger, even for 10 days, felt like something out of a bad romantic comedy. But as she shook Chris's hand, she reminded herself why she'd said yes. Her graphic design business was hanging by a thread, her landlord was ready to evict her, and she couldn't bear to see her family's small studio shutter its doors. This wasn't just a deal, it was her last chance to turn things around. Chris, on the other hand, looked strangely calm. "We'll keep this professional," he assured her, his tone cool and measured. "No surprises, no unnecessary drama. Just stick to the plan, and this will be over before you know it." Isabella nodded, her mind already spinning with questions. "All right, but if we're going to do this, we need rules." "Boundaries." "Agreed," Chris said, signaling to Elsa, who had quietly entered the cafe to oversee the arrangement. Elsa immediately produced a notepad and began jotting down their terms as Isabella listed them. No physical affection unless required for appearances. All interactions outside of family events would remain strictly business. No interfering in each other's personal lives unless absolutely necessary. Chris smirked at the last rule. "Don't worry, I have zero interest in meddling." "Good," Isabella shot back, her voice sharp. As they ironed out the details, Elsa interrupted. "You'll need to move quickly. Chris's family will expect to meet Isabella within the next 2 days. That means address, a believable story about how you met, and a timeline for how this whirlwind romance unfolded. Whirlwind romance? Isabella echoed, raising an eyebrow. You have to be convincing, Elsa explained. Your relationship needs to seem real enough to fool Chris's family, Mr. Henderson, and anyone else who asks questions. Chris leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Isabella. Can you handle that? Isabella folded her arms. You're asking me to lie to a room full of people who've known you for years. Let's hope I'm as sharp as you think I am. The next 48 hours were a blur. Elsa, efficient as always, coordinated every detail. Isabella was fitted for a sleek, minimalist wedding dress that perfectly matched Chris's polished style. A local judge was secured for a quick, no-frills courthouse ceremony. As the big day approached, Isabella found herself standing in front of a mirror in the tiny dressing room of the courthouse. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Hair styled in soft waves, makeup subtly enhancing her natural features. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that this was a real wedding, that she wasn't about to marry a man she'd met 3 days ago. When she stepped into the courtroom, Chris was already waiting. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, and for the first time, Isabella noticed something in his expression, a flicker of nervousness. You clean up well, she said, trying to lighten the mood. So do you, Chris replied, his voice softer than she expected. The ceremony itself was over in minutes. The judge's words blurred together as Isabella focused on keeping her composure. When it came time for the kiss, Chris hesitated briefly before leaning in, brushing his lips against hers with calculated precision. It was the most transactional kiss she'd ever experienced, but it did the job. As they exited the courthouse, cameras from Chris's family's PR team snapped photos to document the occasion. Isabella forced a smile, reminding herself that this was all part of the plan. After the whirlwind ceremony, the reality of their unusual arrangement began to sink in. Later that evening, as they prepared to embark on their honeymoon, Isabella turned to Chris. So, what's next? A private jet to some exotic island? Chris smirked, gesturing to the waiting vehicle. It wasn't a jet. It was a refurbished green camper van. Meet Sage, Chris said dryly. You're home for the next 10 days. Isabella stared at the van, her jaw dropping. You're kidding, right? This is your idea of a honeymoon? Chris shrugged. It's not exactly my choice. My grandmother's will requires us to travel across the countryside in this thing. Apparently, she thought it would teach me about humility or some nonsense like that. Isabella groaned, already regretting her decision. But as she climbed into the van and took her seat beside Chris, she realized one thing. This was going to be the strangest 10 days of her life. The engine sputtered as the green camper van, affectionately nicknamed Sage, rolled onto the open highway. Inside, Isabella sat with her arms crossed, glaring at the peeling dashboard while Chris fiddled with the radio, trying to find a station that wasn't static. This is what I signed up for, Isabella muttered, shaking her head. A road trip in a tin can? Chris shot her a sideways glance, his tone deadpan. It's character building, or so my grandmother would say. The first few hours were awkward. The camper, despite its quaint exterior, was a far cry from the luxury both of them were used to. The narrow bed, cramped kitchenette, and a shower that offered barely a trickle of cold water were just the start. Isabella had grown up learning to make do with less, but she couldn't help finding humor in watching Chris, a man who probably hadn't touched a frying pan in his life, struggle with the stove. I think you're supposed to light the burner first, Isabella quipped, leaning against the counter as Chris wrestled with the knobs. I know that, Chris snapped, but the flush on his cheeks betrayed his frustration. A second later, the burner flared to life, nearly singeing his tailored sleeve. Isabella stifled a laugh. Move over, city boy. Let me show you how it's done. As the days passed, the challenges piled up. The van's engine wheezed on steep inclines, the fridge broke down, and they got lost more than once on backcountry roads. But amidst the chaos, small moments began to surface. Moments that chipped away at the formal walls they had built around each other. During a stop in a quiet lakeside town, Chris surprised Isabella with her favorite coffee, remembering her order from the cafe. "I figured you'd need this," he said, handing her the steaming cup. "Thanks," Isabella replied, a bit startled. "I didn't think you paid attention to details like that." "I pay attention to things that matter," Chris said simply, leaving her momentarily speechless. On another evening, while the van was parked at a scenic overlook, they sat outside under a canopy of stars, wrapped in blankets to fend off the chilly air. Isabella, sipping hot chocolate, glanced at Chris. "So, do you miss your fancy penthouse yet?" Chris smirked. "I'd be lying if I said no, but this isn't as bad as I thought it would be." "High praise," Isabella teased, her laughter breaking the quiet of the night. Chris leaned back, gazing at the stars. "You know, I don't think I've slowed down like this in years. Always running to the next meeting, the next deal. I didn't realize how much I needed this." Isabella looked at him, surprised by the hint of vulnerability in his voice. "Guess your grandmother knew what she was doing after all." The van, affectionately referred to as Sage, became more than just a vehicle. It became a space where Chris and Isabella started to let their guards down. Chris, despite his polished exterior and aloof demeanor, began to reveal a dry sense of humor and a surprising thoughtfulness. Isabella, in turn, shared pieces of her life, her struggles with her freelance business, her love for art, and the studio she hoped to save. One night, while attempting to cook pasta on the van's temperamental stove, Chris turned to Isabella with a sheepish grin. "I think I just invented a new dish, burnt noodles a la Sage." Isabella burst out laughing, grabbing the pot from him. "Okay, chef, step aside. Let me show you how a real meal is made." For the first time, the line between business partners and something more began to blur. What started as a cold, calculated arrangement now felt warm, almost natural. Chris found himself looking forward to Isabella's teasing remarks, while she began to appreciate the quiet moments of kindness he offered. The 10th day arrived with a mix of tension and inevitability. Chris and Isabella had spent the past 9 days navigating the unpredictable journey, both on the road and in their relationship. What started as a calculated business arrangement had shifted into something far more complicated, though neither of them dared to say it aloud. They parked Sage outside the Carter family estate, a sprawling mansion nestled in the hills outside San Francisco. The house buzzed with activity as relatives, friends, and employees gathered for a formal reception to honor Chris and Isabella's marriage. Among the crowd was Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. "You ready for this?" Isabella asked as they stepped out of the van. He straightened his tie, his expression unreadable. "As ready as I'll ever be." Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Isabella could feel the weight of dozens of curious stares as they entered the grand hall. Chris's family, dressed in designer attire and armed with champagne flutes, barely masked their skepticism. "Chris," called a voice from across the room. A middle-aged man with a striking resemblance to Chris strode over, his smile tight. This was William Carter, Chris's uncle and a long-standing critic of his lifestyle. "And this must be the new Mrs. Carter," William said, his tone dripping with condescension. Isabella extended her hand, determined to stay composed. "Pleased to meet you." William barely shook her hand before turning back to Chris. "She's, different from what I expected. I was under the impression you'd never settle down." "Life surprises us all," Chris replied smoothly, his arm slipping around Isabella's waist. The evening dragged on as they mingled with guests, answering endless questions about their love story. They had rehearsed the details, but under Mr. Henderson's piercing gaze, Isabella felt her confidence waver. Finally, Henderson approached them, his demeanor cool and professional. "Chris, Isabella, may I have a word?" The couple followed him to a private study where he gestured for them to sit. "I've observed you both closely these past few days," Henderson began, folding his hands neatly on the desk. "And while your story is compelling, I must admit certain details don't quite align." Chris leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. "What exactly are you implying?" Henderson's gaze shifted to Isabella. "Your backgrounds, for one. A whirlwind romance between a tech mogul and a freelance artist is unusual, to say the least." Isabella's heart raced, but she met Henderson's gaze steadily. Love doesn't always follow logic, Mr. Henderson. Chris and I met by chance, but we connected because we challenge each other in ways no one else ever has. That's not something you can fake. Chris nodded, his voice softening. She's right. I didn't expect to meet someone like Isabella, but she's changed my life. She makes me better, and I don't want to imagine life without her. The sincerity in his words surprised even him. This wasn't part of their rehearsed answers. It was the truth. Isabella turned to Chris, her eyes glistening. And Chris has shown me a world I never thought I could be part of. Not because of his success, but because of his heart. He's taught me to believe in myself again. Henderson watched them closely, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he finally nodded. I believe you. Relief washed over them, but there was no time to celebrate. Henderson escorted them back to the hall, where Chris's family awaited the final verdict. Standing before the crowd, Henderson cleared his throat. After careful observation, I am satisfied that this marriage fulfills the terms of Margaret Carter's will. The room erupted in polite applause, though Chris barely noticed. All he could focus on was Isabella, standing beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. As the applause faded, Chris turned to her. Isabella, I need to tell you something. She looked up at him, her expression curious. This started as a deal, but somewhere along the way everything changed. You challenged me, made me see the world differently, and showed me what really matters. I love you. Not because of the arrangement, but because of the person you are. Isabella's breath caught. For a moment, the room and its many watching eyes disappeared. Chris, she began, her voice trembling, I didn't expect this either, but I love you too. The crowd's murmurs turned into cheers as Chris pulled Isabella into his arms, their kiss sealing not just the terms of the will, but a new chapter in their lives. For Chris and Isabella, this wasn't the end of their journey. It was just the beginning. Chris and Isabella's journey shows us that love can bloom in the most unexpected ways. What do you think? Can a relationship that starts as a deal turn into something real? We'd love to hear your thoughts about their story and what you'd do in their place. Drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going.